this time of year when the outside air used to be fresh, crisp, and invigorating, but not anymore, because Environment Canada says that this is due to migrating smoke from the wildfires out west. And it's a truly ominous setting for our discussion today on addressing the climate crisis on the road to Glasgow. Climate change for most people in the Western world is no longer something they see on TV of bushfires in the Congo or landslides in Indonesia or floods in Bangladesh. It is now at all our doorsteps, burning down homes, flooding subways, making the summers unbearably hot and winters unusually mild. The signs are there for all to see and feel, and yet we need an IPCC report to tell us that climate change is real. Isn't this short-sightedness the greatest threat to our survival? Personally, I've engaged in the climate change mitigation and sustainable development process for 14 years now in desperately vulnerable communities in Kenya, in the deserts of Western India, in the forests of Sundarbans, in the Amazon rainforest. And the devastation wrought by climate change and consequent biodiversity loss and its impact on these communities is unimaginable. Girls in the Kenyan villages have to walk miles farther and longer to get water. Now, every year, the coastal villages in the Sundarbans are devastated by typhoons. Water is almost non-existent in the run of Kutch, the community of salt farmers we work with in Western India. So time is well and truly running out. We have to move faster, more decisively, and address the impacts of climate change in all its dimensions. And I'm delighted that we have with us here today an intergenerational panel of speakers who will share their vast experience and knowledge in charting the course for the difficult journey that we have ahead of us. Our esteemed speakers today are Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and member of GWL Voices; Erica Moines, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama; Maria Fernanda Espinosa, President of the 73rd Session of the UN General Assembly, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and of National Defense of Ecuador, and member and consultant of GWL Voices; Myrna Cunningham, Indigenous leader, chair of the Fund for Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, former president of the UN Forum on Indigenous Peoples, and chair of the Climate and Tenure Advisory Board; and McKenna Mugai, student at the African Leadership Academy. The first question that I would request our speakers to address in about 3 minutes each is, why is the multilateral system, despite the adoption of the Paris Agreement, not able to deliver on climate change mitigation? What actions and changes need to be taken to better equip it to deal with the climate crisis? So I'd first like to give the floor to Mrs. Robinson.
Thank you very much, Kakashan. And could I just begin by saying that you know how much I really like that we talk about climate in an intergenerational dialogue, because you young people are very smart and very direct, and you're talking truth to power in a way that is very helpful. Your question is one that I feel, a certain guilt about for my generation, because the multilateral system is not responding adequately enough. But of course, it's really the member states, it's each of the countries that is not taking its responsibility. It's companies that are not taking their responsibility. It's investment that's not taking its responsibility enough. But it is very worrying. We're about to have COP26, and a report just a day or two ago from the UN calculated that we should be reducing, as we know from the IPCC, our emissions by 45% by 2030. Instead, they're going to increase by 16% if we continue as we are. That's not acceptable, not tolerable. So we need to use moments like the UN General Assembly that we're in now, like the G20, like especially the COP26. The report in August of the IPCC was really a call that this is our last chance for humanity, a slim chance of staying at 1.5 degrees Some people have called that very depressing, call it kind of energizing, because it's a slim chance for our future. Of course we have to. And, Christiana Figueres has described the situation as if we're in a bus, we have a whole crowd of children and a bus is hurtling towards them. Do we do nothing or do we save the children? So, we have to understand that we must put pressure at all levels, and we must, luckily, everything is becoming more transparent. We know the companies that are most responsible. We know the countries that have not yet made their pledges, their nationally determined contributions. It's China, it's Russia, it's India, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Turkey, it's Australia, etc. We know, so we can start really putting pressure in a concerted way. And then we need also the nature-based solutions and we need the 100 billion a year by COP26, because unless we get that 100 billion guaranteed, there will be no trust between countries, especially poor developing countries and indigenous peoples. So we have a lot to do, but in my view, I'm more energized as the situation becomes more urgent.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Yes, while the numbers do look grim, it should be a call to action for us, not just for us to say, oh my God, and just leave it behind. We have to act now. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Minister Moines.
I same lens of what Mary mentioned. The important thing is how you start pressuring upwards. If your citizens believe in this and they demand it from their politicians, from their government, and that's at every level, right? If we demand it, it becomes then something popular, something political that then they in turn drive the necessary public policies in place. And then that same pressure should go from smaller countries to bigger economies that are not doing their part. In Panama, we're one of the 3 countries in the world that is carbon negative. Bhutan, Suriname, and Panama are the only countries that are carbon negative at this moment, meaning we're not aiming to be by 2030 or by 2050. We're already doing our part. We're not receiving any resources. So we are showing that regardless of what types of economy, Panama has an economy base of services. We have a main waterway. You can do it if there's political will. So I think bottom line, there has not been enough political will in order to drive the change. And now you turn the news and every second or third news is related to the climate change. So hopefully we'll see the real accountability that is now needed in order to drive that change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Minister. And it's wonderful to hear that Panama is carbon negative. One of the countries you mentioned, Suriname, is actually one of the countries I've personally worked in. But, we absolutely need that political will, as you said, and also educated citizens and politicians to take all that necessary steps and, hold those responsible accountable. So thank you once again. Ms. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kakashi. I'm thrilled to be here today. Thank you to GWL for bringing us together. And I have to say, the first time, a wake-up call when Mary Robinson visited me when I was elected president of the General Assembly. And she said, I know you're passionate about climate. I've been in climate negotiations for about 20 years now. But she said, here, the key is an intergenerational approach to this. And she taught me that. And that's one of the reasons why we are here today in a way. So thank you, Mary, for that, for waking us all up to see that it's a collective solution, but it is an intergeneration solution as well. So going straight to your question, why we are not doing what we need to do to stabilize our climate. And I think that, as we heard, we have the knowledge, we have the technology, we have the resources, and yet we are not doing enough. Because of time constraints. There's several reasons, but I would like perhaps to very quickly tackle on 2. One could be a sort of a global tragedy of the commons in a way. The well-known work from Harding in 1968, where he argues that in the absence of a owner of an authority and a set of enforceable rules, individuals, or in our case, countries, are looking to maximize their individual national gains, consume as much of our common goods as possible and as fast as they can. So, and this behavior will lead to what we already know, and you said it so clearly, Kekashian, at the beginning: erosion, scarcity, depletion and pollution of resources, etc., that is affecting, putting in risk the lives of millions and the well-being of society, and particularly to our future generation. In other words, I think that a stable climate should be considered a global common good. And the use of atmospheric space should be shared equally. When we hear that Panama is a carbon negative country, there is, a long way to go. There is this principle of the UN Convention on Climate Change of common but differentiated responsibility. And that's when multilateralism comes to play. And we need to make, to shape multilateral responses that are, that are in the dimension and the urgency of the problem. And perhaps the number two reason, there are many more, but is related to the first, and how to make international environmental law enforceable. And how to counter the so-called tragedy of the global commons. The key issue is an effective and accountable global governance architecture. The UN Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement are the instruments, but we need more action. You said it very well. We need to put pressure. We need to say what we need to say, especially the younger generations. There have been countless initiatives and experiments, for example, regarding climate bonds, climate markets, to put a price tag in carbon, but it is still not enough. Solutions are not only economic, arithmetic, they are political, behavioral, values-based in a way. And the second challenge that I was referring to is that in the last 40 years, we have had important developments in international environmental law, the Stockholm Declaration, the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, which didn't work in '97, etc., the Paris Agreement, the SDGs. But I think that the challenge is enforcement, is this implementation deficit. And I think that in order to overcome these two challenges, the world needs a new social contract that, as clearly stated in our common agenda, this report presented by the Secretary General last Friday. And perhaps we can go back to this new social contract that redefines the relationship between society, our economy, politics, and nature. And this new social pact, in my opinion, should contain, three components. To establish a legal status of nature. As you know, the Ecuadorian Constitution provides rights to nature, rights to exist as a global commons and a heritage of humanity. And second, it must address the need for a mechanism that guides and monitors the implementation of norms and standards of environmental international law. And here, perhaps something to look forward to is the Global Pact for the Environment, which is in the making and can be a promising instrument. And of course, we need changes in our production and consumption patterns. We need transformation in our value system. There is, I say always that climate change is not the problem. It's a symptom of a dysfunctional society in a way. And these are the issues that we need to tackle in a comprehensive, intergenerational way. And we need to speak up and tell our leaders what we need to, what we would like them to say tomorrow, as the UN General Assembly is starting in New York tomorrow. So back to you, Kekasha.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maria. And yes, it is that apathy and short-sightedness of human society that has led us to where we are right now. The tragedy of the commons is a good lens to analyze our current situation. And it's really sad that the planet is often just looked as a public good with open access. And it seems that, everyone has to fight to access it. But that's really not true, because we can have equitable access to its resources if we just had that mindset change. And of course, you mentioned the implementation deficit, and that's such a huge challenge to address. We have the agreements, but not the policies. We have the policies, but not the implementation, and that really helps no one. So yes, we do need to act with urgency right now. Thank you once again. I now give the floor to Ms. Myrna Cunningham.
Thank you, Naxa Al Sutralam Kulatara. I bring you greetings from the Miskito indigenous peoples of Nicaragua, from the autonomous region that we are building in the last decades. From indigenous peoples, intergenerational and intercultural dialogue is important. That is the way in which we have ensured resilience to face climate change and all of the other challenges that our community are facing. So I really appreciate this conversation. One of the biggest challenges to achieve the implementation of mitigation actions defined in the Paris agreements is to have a paradigm shift of how we are observing the current climate crisis. Because achieving implementation with mitigation actions implies higher commitments from the parties that signed the agreement, especially from those countries that are major emitters of greenhouse gases. As it has been mentioned, the latest IPCC report already shows that we are in a situation where the current scenario is increasingly problematic. In all of our countries, we are facing problems. The commitments of joint work between the state parties, the different actors, the private sector, must be governed under this logic of paradigm shift, and where no one is left behind in the process. The precept of shared but differentiated responsibilities must be brought back to the table once again. There are countries at a global level that are defining actions and policies to keep their emissions low and necessary. But at the same time, we see that the larger emitters are not taking actions, or these are insufficient to stop emissions. And therefore, the increase in temperature and the consequences that we're having, we are seeing them now, and we will have more in the future. Another point is that to achieve massive processes of mitigation actions, there must be finance for developing countries. And that is the agreement. But all the defined financing agreements have not yet been fulfilled. The technology for mitigation action is still very expensive for those developing countries. And without a real commitment system, it is difficult for it to be developed in the best way. The issue of mitigation is important, and also the issue of technology transfer and financing to realize it in developing countries should be a basis for discussion and real commitment. But it is also important to bear in mind that these processes must go hand in hand with human rights-based approach as established in the Paris Agreement. Without that, the impact can be greater for those communities and peoples like indigenous peoples where these actions have to be carried out. The participation of the different stakeholders and the collective work towards the same end is the basis at this moment in which we are living this rapidly escalating crisis. I agree that the General Assembly at the UN and its convenings, the meetings that have been planned in the coming weeks and days are seen as the best space for G20 or G7 countries to ensure their global commitments. The informal commitments, for example, on climate action and security and energy are very important spaces where we do expect to see commitments before we get to Glasgow. If we don't see that, I don't see future for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mirna. I really liked how you said that, intergenerational and intercultural dialogue is so crucial. And of course, our current Western hegemonic ways of thinking often forget this. And that is a big part of that paradigm shift that we're all looking towards. And it's really sad to see that the consequences of the actions of the biggest emitters is, of course, affecting our most vulnerable. And as you said, it's extremely important to have that climate finance. We can't just go into an LDC and tell them to be climate smart when they don't have the basic access to food and shelter. And that's exacerbated by climate change. So, of course, we need that human rights approach, and that is why we need climate justice for all. Thank you once again. And with that, I give the floor to McKenna.
I really hope you guys can hear me. So to answer the question, which is basically asking, why isn't this multilateral system working? And I feel as though it's not being effective to its application being implemented to already decade-old systems that simply cannot change overnight. But what I mean by these systems is the institutional systems that have been put in place. We must take into account that there have been institutions set up since way before I was even born, and they already have processes and steps that make it difficult for immediate action to be seen or to be implemented. So I'll just say that I've never been in a political position of power in any way, shape, or form. I'm still a high school student, and I therefore cannot speak on such systems entirely. However, what I can say is that maybe the need for immediate action is a wake-up call for authorities to listen. And by this, I mean adapting the multilateral system to the already existing systems or vice versa. I think that is something that should be taken into consideration rather than forcing the multilateral system to work right now. And then my ultimate suggestion would be for nations to be held accountable for the goals that they put in place for themselves by a higher body. Now, that is a nice suggestion because I don't know how the world necessarily operates entirely, but it is, I believe that it is implementable. Yeah, I really hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, McKenna. And yes, you're absolutely right. We do need to hold the biggest emitters accountable and ensure that they live up to achieving the goals. The Paris Agreement is non-binding, and therefore a lot of countries still feel that they have a lot of leeway to continue emitting and changing the rules. But yes, absolutely, our biggest emitters do need to be held to account so that our most vulnerable populations don't get impacted by the biggest threat that exists right now, that is climate change. So thank you once again, and thank you to all of our panelists for your responses. We will now hear from each of our speakers from their unique perspectives on this balance between climate ambition, need, and the political realities in about 5 minutes each. So the first question is to Minister Moines. This year's COP is taking place in a unique and unprecedented environment. It's dominated by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how should the COP26 process evolve to take into account these new challenges?
It is very interesting how to shape the discussion when we're still coming out of a pandemic, right? So we are facing the crisis of our times, which is the global warming, yet we're still, every single country of ours is still in the midst of trying to fight the pandemic. So it is not easy, and it has driven a lot of countries, to not to say all of them, to look inwards and to try to solve the issues nationally rather than looking up and try to deal in a multilateral fashion. And that has been a problem. And I can say for my region, the Latin American region, we've been one of the hardest hit regions with the pandemic. We only account for 8% of the population, yet we have close to 30% of the death related to COVID. So we did not fare well with the pandemic. And same for the vaccines, the same. So the entire planet, the discussion is the same. My region did not fare well in the vaccines, and it doesn't seem like anything's going to change for the next year, right? So we failed this time, but we're not fixing it for the next year. And it seems like the same players doing the same thing, and we are not coming to terms and understanding that we need to come out of this together, and it's not okay just for one country to vaccinate their entire population. I think that with the climate change and in the fight, it's the same idea that you cannot deal with it just looking inwards and driving public policy yourself without the help of others. It is important, your achievements, and one example for us is we just recently passed the 30% protection of our oceans. We're one of the few within our continent that have that. And that's wonderful for the marine corridor that we have. But if we were able to do it regionally, and that's what we're working with Costa Rica, with Colombia, with Ecuador, so all of them do or enact the protection of their 30% of their oceans, there would be this massive corridor, marine corridor, that we could get protected. So you can see how dealing with it in a true multilateral fashion and making sure that regionally you can deliver something that is a lot more powerful than what you can do just from an individual perspective. So it will be important that regardless of where you sit in sort of dealing with the pandemic and the economic recovery, that there is enough awareness that you cannot just push this for another year or for a few years saying, I'll deal with the pandemic and then later on I'll deal with the environment. It's not an option. And we have, this window of opportunity that is closing, and we really need to make sure that we are enacting true change now, with accountability, with enforcement now, and in a way that it is agreed among all the players involved. And we know which ones need to do more, and we know which ones are doing already enough. And I think it also involves a significant portion of some having more resources to allocate towards this fight, and others, the poorer countries, that the limited resources they have to deal with inequalities. And if you allocate also to deal with natural disasters, you're not breaking the cycle of poverty within our country. So you have the entire Caribbean, that natural disaster after natural disaster, hurricane after hurricane, and the little resources that they have are allocated to deal with the disaster rather than with the cycle of poverty. So these are hard questions, again, because it's easier to look inwards and to make sure that you have enough resources for your own needs. And it might be the more popular thing to do or the more political. So that's why I am convinced that the more change that is driven from a sort of grassroots movement upwards, and that all our politicians, including myself, everybody understands the value of this, and that the powerful economies are taking this into account, will be extremely important as we deal with failure for the COP26 or not coming out with the true commitments that we're looking forward. It's not something that we can afford at this time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Minister. It is with what you said, we need that empathy that will allow us to view someone else's challenges as one's own. And it's really scary to note how this pandemic has affected all of us, and some regions specifically. And at the same time, you're all dealing with climate change, and that's an inequality multiplier. And now the opportunity is right for us to come together through multilateralism to show us the way forward, where we can share best practices and address these interconnected challenges, as you said, so that we can really come out of this chasm together, where we address the vaccine inequality, safety measures, climate just solutions, poverty alleviation. And it can be addressed if we just, as you said, a bottom-up movement that allows everyone to see someone else's challenges as their own, so that we can address all of these problems together. So thank you once again. McKenna, I wanted to ask you, as a young person from Africa, a continent that has arguably witnessed the greatest impacts of anthropogenic climate change, what do you think are the critical gaps that need to be addressed during COP26 and beyond to address the specific challenges of this region?
Okay, so I'll start by saying, again, I'm not a politician or any way. I have not taken any critical leadership stance on the matter, but I will speak as someone that has an experience of living on the continent and that has witnessed for similar situations and is familiar with the circumstances that people are undergoing on the continent. So many people here already have their own, by here I mean on the continent, already have their own issues to deal with, if I'm not lying. Some people are trying to survive on the bare minimum, while others are simply trying to have a higher education. And therefore, the topic of climate change might not even be relevant to their immediate problems. It is, however, evident that impacts are hitting us, from the livelihoods of local farmers in Kenya being threatened by locusts and the South African water crisis. We must prioritize resource allocation to developing countries. And I don't mean just countries across the continent, but other developing countries around the world, because they have already they're barely contributing to their own downfall. I hope that makes sense. For decades, the world has not been in favor of developing countries and offer pity rather than remittance, if that makes sense. So I find it crucial to address the need for more support systems, structures, and allocation of resources that address the relevant for risk communities and areas that are highly impacted by climate change, along with listening to the voices on the continent and of those outside the continent are waiting to be heard by superpowers and the Western world. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, McKenna. I think lived experiences are extremely crucial, and it's really sad that they're often forgotten in many parts of the world when discussing policy changes. And lived experiences need to be heard, because that is the true story from the ground up, and that is where climate change affects people the most. And as you said, in some certain parts of the world, it's very difficult for people to even think about climate change when they don't have access to the basic human rights like education and food and water. But of course, climate change is that inequality multiplier, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And that's why we need that climate justice, where we address all of these interconnections. And of course, we do need to move beyond the pity and simply feeling sorry for communities, and actually start acting and taking true action at all levels, whether it's at policymaking or right on the ground. So thank you once again. Ms. Maria, I wanted to ask that, based on your extensive international experience that's seen the evolution of the climate change mitigation process from its early days to its present state, what do you think have been the positives so far, and what are the glaring shortcomings that need to be tackled, both with respect to policy and implementation?
Well, I think this is a great question, but it was so wisely answered by McKenna and Myrna. And and all of this stellar all-women panel. I mean, we are all women here, and from different generations, different parts of the world, and it is not a coincidence. But we do coincide on the need to be bold and responsible with future generations in terms of our actions. And of course, we do have a blueprint. It's the Paris Agreement. We have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have hundreds of regulations and norms everywhere, protection agencies, environmental law, etc. But we need to be serious about implementation. And when we are told what to expect for Glasgow, and I think Mirna was, she said it so clearly. Yes, Glasgow, but we need to hear from leaders here at the UN General Assembly. We need to hear the same consistent narrative in the upcoming, not only a climate COP, but the conference on oceans, the biodiversity conference, the G20. We need consistency. And there is a lot of homework ahead of us. And let me just give you an example of the implementation deficit that we are facing. In mitigation, there is a gap of approximately 80% in climate mitigation actions with respect to what it's necessary to limit the increase of global temperature by 1.5 degrees by 2030. This is clearly stated in the Paris Agreement. So 80% deficit. And a recent report says that nationally determined contribution, which is self-imposed targets and commitments from countries, are really far from being met. And if even if we meet and we comply with what we committed, the temperature rise would be 2.7 degrees instead of 1.5 degrees. So there is a mismatch there. There is a arithmetic of that is showing that we need to do more and urgently. So it is not about only 2050 or 2030. It is now and today. This decade is critical for climate stabilization. The number two issue is climate finance. We heard it from Mirna and from Mary and from all of us. And I think that Minister Moines put the finger where it hurts. It said, she says basically, we need to invest so much money in resilient infrastructure, floods and hurricanes and everything can dismantle the entire infrastructure of an island state, of a coastal area like Panama, even if it's a carbon negative country. Going back to the climate finance gap, the goal of the Paris Agreement was to mobilize 100 billion annually in climate finance by 2020. And this was agreed not in Paris, even before, in Cancun. And this goal has not been met. To meet only this year's goal on finance, the mobilization of 20 billion is still required. And I know that Mirna knows the numbers. She's very well connected to the Green Climate Fund, but we are in need of resources for the global South. I mentioned this gap, this mismatch on the national determined contributions. We do not agree what is the starting point and what are the years that we need to compare among ourselves if we are really delivering on the NDCs. So I think that tomorrow, as the General Assembly starts, in Glasgow, we need consistent messages. We need to really, really be serious about delivering on the European Green Deal, for example, on the commitments that industrialized countries have made, because, as you said at the beginning, Kekashan, climate change is not an issue that we should worry about in the future. It is something that is living with us, that is causing tremendous pain, displacement, greater poverty, especially for women. And it's unbelievable how much more women are suffering from the impacts of climate change. And at the same time, of course, they are active there. They are absolutely frontliners in advocating for climate justice and climate stabilization. So I really hope that at least these three issues can be dealt with and solved until we go to Glasgow in November. And not to mention that we need to finalize the famous Paris Agreement rulebook. We don't have an operational a book to say this is how we are going to implement our commitment on the Paris Agreement. Still, there are some pending issues that need to be, once and for all finished for in Glasgow. So sorry, I get so, como se dice, passionate, and back to you, Kekashian.
No worries at all. Thank you, Ms. Maria. And absolutely, we do need to be bold and responsible. And once again, we have so many laws, policies, agreements, and that is a positive. But it's really sad to know that despite having all of these meetings and conferences over the last so many years, we still have that implementation gap, and we're still in the midst of a climate crisis that, of course, has a disproportionate effect on our women and girls, our indigenous peoples, our most vulnerable communities. And it's really sad to know that countries would rather spend their money on building weapons of mass destruction rather than focus on climate finance and actually trying to mitigate one of the biggest challenges of our time. So it is crucial that we need to act now. We need a mindset change, and change just has to happen now. So thank you once again. Mrs. Robinson, as one of the main proponents of climate justice, what do you feel needs to be done in order to stimulate greater people-centric actions, especially in the developing world where it is most needed?
Well, Kekashian, I've noticed that you have referenced climate. Sorry, I think I'm muted, am I? Oh, no. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. I've noticed that you've been mentioning climate justice a few times, which I'm very happy about in your own responding to those of us who are answering the questions. And I'm really very happy on this panel to agree with many of the points that are being made. But, when I went to my first climate conference, which was Copenhagen, I admit I've come rather late to the climate issue. I must say, I was really struck by how scientific and technical it was, and actually quite male-dominated at the time. Not many women at the top level as ministers and full delegates. So at Cancun, as Maria Fernanda will remember, we had the women leaders on gender and climate. And that's all part of taking a climate justice approach. It's a people-centered approach, as you have so rightly said. And there are layers of injustice. I'll just go very quickly through at least 5 layers. The first is that climate change has disproportionately affected the poorest countries, the poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples much earlier. Now it's affecting the Northern Hemisphere, and we're all realizing it's everywhere. But for a long time we didn't, and we weren't motivated in the way that those voices from the South were motivated. And that was very important at conferences. They had the urgency because they were affected. Then the second layer, and of course these are the least responsible, and they're also, frankly, the Black and brown and indigenous peoples of our world. So it's also a racial injustice. Secondly, the gender injustice within that, the lack of similar social roles, sometimes the lack of rights like land rights, lack of access to capital, etc., of women who have to make their communities resilient. And it's wonderful that they do it so well, but despite not having this kind of access. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice that you and other young people and McKenna have been calling us out on. And fourthly, the injustice of the pathways to development, which is becoming more of an issue now. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. We have to be grateful to the workers who helped us to build our economies, to the coal and oil and gas workers, and in my country, peat, turf. We've laid off workers in Ireland. We're trying to centre now green energy in that part of Ireland where the bogs are. That's the just transition. So What I'm trying to say is we have to remember that developing countries want to develop and take their people out of poverty. And at the moment, I'm involved in a really good discussion with a women's network, women from Africa and Europe, as part of the Africa-Europe Foundation that's just been established. And we are coming to recognize that African countries are going to need, some African countries anyway, are going to need gas initially as part of the base load in order to actually be able to move to clean energy. No country has totally built its economy on clean energy alone. And so, and yet the multilateral banks are saying we won't support fossil fuel at all. It's a failure to understand a real problem. But just as African countries may need gas, they should also say it's a just transition for them, and they must plan to get out of it as well. As you know, so I've learned a lot from this discussion, because it's profoundly driven, and it's really important that we understand the need to have a baseload on which to then move to cleaner energy, like renewable energy. So, and then the fifth injustice, of course, is the injustice to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. So I like the fact that in this discussion, we've been touching on all of the things that matter. And of the 100 billion, half of it should go to adaptation now, because adaptation in the developing world is so important. And we're into loss and damage, and we have to take loss and damage seriously as well. And so, you know, these are the issues that I'm glad we're able to bring forward.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mrs. Robinson. And, you know, I remember having a conversation with a man from the global north just a few days ago who said to me, I believe climate change is real now because we're finally starting to feel its impacts all around the world. And it was really surprising to me because, as you said, the global south was affected way before the global north, and that included our marginalized communities. And now it's affecting the Western world. But just because it didn't affect our most powerful nations before, it's really sad that people felt there wasn't a need to take action. So we do need that just transition. We need to ensure resilience for all. We have to address loss and damage and really, of course, move towards that climate justice lens and the feminist climate justice lens that will allow us to move forward with a people and planet-centric approach. Thank you once again. Ms. Mirna, my question to you is, how effective and inclusive do you think the COP process has been in engaging Indigenous people in their traditional knowledge of nature, and what needs to change?
Thank you for the question. The inclusion of Indigenous peoples in COPs has changed from year to year. And this year, the UK presidency has engaged in different spaces to advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples and their inclusion in the COP agreements. The Paris Agreement set the precedent for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in this process with the reference in the preamble of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But we want to go beyond the preamble. We want to be at the same negotiating table of the COP. The greatest impact of climate change are in our territories. And the areas where mitigation and adaptation actions are to be carried out are on our lands, our territories, and involve our resources. So the activities surrounding the organization of the COP have included Indigenous peoples in specific events during the last decades, but we want to go farther. The platform of local communities and the Indigenous peoples that was set should be a space where Indigenous peoples can raise our voices so that our knowledge system, our Indigenous knowledge system, can be included in the climate negotiations, and that it can be the guiding thread for actions and agreements that are more inclusive, holistic, and with a rights-based approach. And when we talk about mitigation and financing schemes, it is important to establish mechanisms so that Indigenous peoples themselves can access funds directly. I heard recently we get 1% of finance. 1% goes to indigenous peoples without intermediaries who do not understand our worldview, our interests, and our way of life. So 99% of the financing goes through them. Another important point here is that these actions should also include indigenous peoples in general, and not only indigenous peoples from developing countries, because there are indigenous peoples in developed countries, in rich countries, who are experiencing the impact of climate change on their lands and territories, but without real or adequate attention. There are approximately 9 weeks to go until the start of the COP activities in Glasgow. And the COP presidency has said that this will be one of the most inclusive COPs. But to be inclusive, indigenous people should have an active and effective participation in the negotiation. As the Indigenous Peoples Caucus have stated recently, we have no clarity on what our participation will look like, especially since the logistical arrangements are complicated, and even more so for indigenous representatives. I'm talking about visas, quarantine on arrival, funding for participation under these conditions, hotels, COVID testing, just to mention some. It is not possible to speak of an inclusive COP if we are left out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ms. Mirren. And you're totally right. We cannot call our COPs inclusive unless and until we actually include our indigenous people. And as you said, not just at the preamble level or in a tokenistic manner, but actually having a seat at the table. That is so important. And it's really mind-boggling to know that we're making all of these policies, but we're leaving behind the people who are affected the most by climate change. And then it really leaves us to wonder that if we leave behind these communities, then what exactly are we addressing here? Because then we'll just keep going on in this vicious cycle, and we need to break that. So it is really important that, the time to act is now, and we need our indigenous communities at the front and center, and we need to make that happen right now. So thank you once again for sharing that with us, and thank you so much to all of our panelists once again. And the final quick fire question, this is once again to all of our panelists in about 30 seconds to 1 minute each. What next? What should the states, civil society, stakeholders do to take all of these proposals forward? And what does it take to win the battle against the climate crisis from an intergenerational and intercultural approach? So we'll start this time with McKenna.
Okay, well, that's a very tricky question. I don't know how to generally win the battle of climate change, but what I can say is when addressing the issue, it's important to be adaptable and flexible with each scenario that comes across. And I mean that sense of whatever cultural situation, whatever specific area you want to try to mitigate climate change matters in. And also think of time. Is timing right for a certain tactic to be implemented? I think it's important to ethically respect the ways of others, and when it comes to implementing mitigation tactics and making them sustainable. And by this, I mean applying mitigation tactics in Brazil will not work in Nigeria, nor will implementing the same mitigation tactics in Nigeria work in Kenya. You have to make it relevant to the community that you are trying to impact. So I guess to sum that up, address the issue with the relevant means to a specific society. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much, McKenna. Minister Moines?
Yes, there are several things that one can do, but for 30 seconds, I want to leave one idea, seeing all these wonderful women here. There was a very interesting study carried out in 130 countries that the consequence was that women are more likely to sign on to environmental treaties than men. That's the study, it's done. If we had more women in power and more women in leadership positions, I think we would have more done by now. So I want to see the McKenna, I want to see Kekasha, I want to see all these wonderful women that are coming up as we talk about this, creating opportunities for women to sit at these positions and have the next Mary Robinson, making sure that these are addressed. It's key. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Minister. Ms. Myrna? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Yeah. To win the battle against climate change, first, we need a collective vision that include a dialogue of different knowledges and cultures where all sectors are included. Second, we need to focus on mitigation and adaptation actions that are done at community level from where we can learn and replicate. Solutions to climate change should also be seen as experiences. We should include all of these experiences. The vision of local community-led actions should be an element to achieve the fight against climate change. We need to think as humanity, as a collective, and we all need to fulfill our commitments from state parties until communities level. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Ms. Maria?
Oops. I don't know what to say in 90 seconds, but I would say one phrase: close the gaps and close the mitigation, the finance, the technology transfer gap, but also the participation gap. And I heard loud and clear what Myrna said about participation and voice, not only of indigenous peoples, but of local communities, of young change makers. It's absolutely vital. I think that the only way to phase out climate change is through a genuine multi-actor, intergenerational, intercultural approaches and solutions. Thank you, and back, Kekasha.
Thank you so much. And Mrs. Robinson?
I agree with the points that my colleagues have made so succinctly, but I think really what we have to understand is the moment we're in. You know, the IPCC report in August made it clear there is a slim chance that we can stay at 1.5%. To me, that's a spur to even more urgent action. And we have to galvanize and get the voices heard and close the gaps, as Maria said. We have to do it in an inclusive way. I couldn't agree more with Myrna. We need an inclusive COP despite the problems of COVID and vaccination and the lack of equitable access to vaccines, which is a big problem and a moral outrage, actually. It's disgraceful that there hasn't been fairer access to vaccines, but we need the voices of those most affected for longest and least responsible to be there to ensure that we have a pressure which was there in Paris. That's what got us the 1.5 degrees in Paris, was the voices of indigenous peoples in small island states and least developed. So we need those voices there. And that sense of urgency that delegates do not leave until we're on course for a 1.5 degree world. That's what I'd like to see. They don't leave Glasgow until that is agreed and secure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for such an engaging and productive discussion. I am sure your amazing insights were truly inspiring for all of us who have tuned into this event. Your leadership in tackling this most grievous existential threat of our times is extremely motivating, and especially in this hour of need when we have had the added setbacks caused by the pandemic to overcome. As all of our panelists have stated, the road ahead, it's extremely difficult, but it is not insurmountable. There is hope but only if we act decisively, collaboratively, inclusively, and transparently. And the pandemic should definitely not be an excuse to exclude our most affected communities. Let us use this as the opportunity to build forward equal through localization, through policy implementation, through closing the gaps, and really making our multilateral systems more effective. Thank you once again to our speakers, to the audience for your time. We cannot afford to lose this battle against climate change. Our future depends on it, and we can only do this together. Till we meet again, in person or virtually, please stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.